shields, carved in bronze. And they go out and they march many days. And they come to the mountain. They cross 7 mountain ranges to come to the great cedar forest, where the great cedar trees are. And Gilgamesh goes up on the mountain and says prayers to Shamash, the sun god, who is his special protector. He says, will you protect me and help me in this? And Shamash says, first questions him, why do you want to do it? And Gilgamesh says, well, you have to rid the country of all this evil. Shamash says, well, all right, I don't think it's that great an idea, but he bought the sacrifice. The god bought the sacrifice and said, okay, I'm compassionate, I'll help you, I'll give you these allies, and you'll have 7 fierce winds. The north wind and the icy wind and the frost wind and the hot wind that will be your allies in this fight against this terrific giant Humbaba if you should need them. And Gilgamesh had a dream on the mountain before they came to the forest. And in this dream, he dreamed that he and Enkidu were in the canyon underneath the mountain, and they were like tiny gnats under the mountain. And then he had another dream, a second dream on another night, in which he dreamed that the mountain fell on him and crushed his body, pinned his body under the rock. And then a great light came out of the rock and turned into a light being, a light man figure, who lifted the rock up and freed him. And Gilgamesh told this dream to Enkidu, and Enkidu interpreted it. Throughout the story, Gilgamesh has dreams, and Enkidu is better at interpreting them and saying what they mean. The instinctual man, the wild man, is more intuitive, more connected with nature, more connected with the unconscious, altered states of consciousness. And he says, this is a very favorable dream. This means we will succeed in our fight against this giant because you have this light God helping you. And then Gilgamesh had a third dream, which was a disaster where dust clouds blackened the sky, volcanic eruptions, dust settled over everything. For many days and nights, nothing but darkness. They came to the forest. The forest was an enchanted forest. It had a magical, enchanted gate around it, outside of it. And when they came to the gate, Enkidu touched it and said to Gilgamesh, don't touch this gate. What just happened to me is that my whole arm and hand went paralyzed and weak when I touched the gate. So you have to smash the gates, he said to Enkidu. I'll leave it to you to think about what this means. This whole myth of going in and slaying the forest giant is the myth of our ecological catastrophe that we're presently in. We are the people, in the form of the lumber companies, supported by government and industry, who go in and cut down the giant cedar forests, and the giant rainforests in the Amazon, and the cedar forests in the Northwest, to build our cities. And in doing so, we violate the guardian spirits of nature that are assigned to protect those and maintain those groves, as sacred forests, sacred to the gods. So I think it's interesting to say that right here in this oldest myth of our culture, dating back to maybe 3,000 years BC, we have this ecological dilemma already indicated very clearly. Because then they go into the forest and the giant recedes into the inner recesses of the forest and they don't see him, and Gilgamesh proceeds to start cutting down the great cedar trees. This summer I was up on Vancouver Island, on the west coast of Vancouver Island, where they have these cedar forests, and where the connection between what's happening now and this myth became clear to me. These cedar trees sometimes are over 1,000 years old. They are 50 or 60 feet in diameter. They are the most magnificent trees that you can imagine. And they're being cut down. So he proceeded to cut down these cedar trees. And when he had cut down very many of them, he fell into a coma, a sleep coma, from which he could not rouse himself for several days. Like Enkidu, who his wrist and hand got paralyzed, Gilgamesh cut down the cedar trees. He became paralyzed, fell into a coma. Humbaba, the giant, in the meantime, the giant forest guardian, heard the cedar trees being cut down and came out of the inner recesses of the forest to where Gilgamesh and Enkidu were, having cut down the trees. Enkidu managed to rouse Gilgamesh just in time from his sleep, and it is said that Humbaba fixed them with his fierce eye, his eye of death. He fixated them with his eye of death. As in another Sumerian myth, Eresh Kigal, the goddess of death, fixates Inanna, the goddess of heaven, with the eye of death. And Gilgamesh calls upon the allies given to him by the sun god, the north wind and the frost wind and the icy wind and the hot wind and the fierce wind and the hurricane wind. And they come and they blow and they confuse and immobilize the giant, so he cannot fight effectively. And so Enkidu and Gilgamesh are able to pounce upon the giant and cut off his head. And drag him, the body, and the cedar logs back to the city. Before they kill him, one other last telling episode. The giant, he's been caught by them, by the combination of the winds and Enkidu and Gilgamesh's strength. He's trapped, he's caught. He appeals to them. He says, "Don't kill me. I am doing my job here as guardian of the forest. You have seen the abode of the gods, which is in the inner recesses behind these forests, the beautiful Edenic garden, the garden of Ishtar, the garden of the sun god, are all protected by this forest. You have seen it. You should let me go. I am the guardian. I'm doing my job. I was sent here to protect this forest. Don't let me go." And Gilgamesh says, "Well, I'm inclined to agree with you. I think we should let you go. This catching animals and wild creatures is not such a good idea. I think we should let you go," Gilgamesh says. And Enkidu says, interestingly enough, "I don't think that's a good idea, because if you let him go, he'll kill you." So Enkidu is suspicious. He doesn't trust the other forest dweller, the other forest wild creature, because he knows basically what he wants is to escape, and he'll do his best to continue his role. So he says, if you want to really get rid of this giant, you better kill him now while you got him, because if you don't, he'll get you. So Gilgamesh says, "Well, you're right." So they kill him. So it's a very interesting story in that, it's the arrogant human still who wants to go out, who creates an enemy out of nature in order to exploit nature, calls nature evil. That's what the Christians did later on. And violates the sacred integrity of nature for his own exploitative ends. The wild, instinctual part of him tries to warn him, but then when he does agree to go along, because he has no choice, because he is one with him, he is the same person, he then has a better understanding of what the real issue is and what really needs to be done to accomplish the objective. Where Gilgamesh still is more likely to be compassionate. So it's not a black and white story. It's not like Gilgamesh is all bad and Enkidu is all good, It's not the noble savage either. It's the canny wild man. It's a very different thing. And they both together, after all, because they are together, they're both in the same fate. They both suffer the same fate and the same consequences. So then they go back to the city. That's the end of the second main story of that. And I'll just tell you the third one. I'll leave out the last one. Well, because I don't want to take too much time. The last one has to do, the third of these stories in this epic has to do with the story with the goddess Ishtar. After they come back and they get great admiration, and the people of the city, oh, Gilgamesh, what a hero, and Enkidu, what a hero, what mighty men, what great heroes and warriors to have killed this huge giant, and look how huge this giant is, and his head is huge, and his body is huge. And Ishtar, the goddess, says to Gilgamesh, I want you for my lover. I want you to come and be my lover, and together we will have great enjoyment. And you will be my preferred lover, you who are so strong and virile. And Gilgamesh says, in this old tale, he says, I don't want to be your lover. Number one, I don't know what to give you. I wouldn't know how to feed a goddess, for example, the way I know how to take care of a wife. I wouldn't know what you need. And number two, and more importantly, what about the history of your previous lover? What about Tammuz? Look what happened to him. He was your lover, and he got killed for your sake. And the people are still bemoaning him and crying, Tammuz, Tammuz, where are you? Where are you? Every year they cry for him. And what about the bird, the man that you turned into a bird? He was your lover, and now he's a bird with a broken wing who goes around flapping his wings in a paralyzed fashion. And what about the lion who became your lover? And look what happened to him. He got caught and killed by the lion hunters. And look about the stallion. What happened to him? He got caught and he got captured and made domestic, and he's now experiences the whip and the spur and the saddle. And what about that other man? And you turned him into a mole. He's under the ground. I don't want to be your lover. Look what happened to the others. And Ishtar was furious. This is a story of the male gods, the patriarchal hero warriors with their male gods, and their reaction of fear and distrust of the goddess and of the feminine. And Ishtar went to her father Anu and said, Ishtar, Gilgamesh has insulted me tremendously, and I'm just enraged. And her father Anu said, well, you know what he said was true. That's your story. You did all those things. What can you expect? She said, I don't care. I've been grievously insulted, and I demand that you give me the bull of heaven to punish these people. And if you don't allow me to send down the bull of heaven to punish these people, I'm going to open the gates of the underworld and allow the dead to come up and eat food with the living. See how you like that? And he said, well, okay. You can have the bull of heaven. The old gods knew the power of the goddess, even though, it had been turned around where she's the daughter. Originally, of course, she's not the daughter, she's the mother of the gods. That's how the myth got turned around. This myth is a very interesting myth of a hybrid of the old goddess culture myths, the old creator goddess, created the gods and the humans, and the new male god, sky god mythology. Flips back and forth from one point of view to the other. And Anu, her father, said, well, if you're going to send down the bull of heaven, have you taken the precautionary measures? I mean, the people will be out of food for 7 years, and there'll be a tremendous famine and so forth. And she said, I've seen to it. They've got grain stored up. They'll be okay. They'll survive. She sent down the bull of heaven, which some people say is a drought. Some people say, I prefer the notion that it was like a flooding. Tigris and Euphrates Valley probably flooded, had numbers of devastating floods that simply wiped out, because it said the bull of heaven came down, killed 100 men with his first snort, and his second snort, another 200 men, and another 300 men, wiped out hundreds of people, wiped out the cities, wiped out a major disaster, in other words. Gilgamesh and Enkidu attacked the bull of heaven, and in a great struggle, during which Enkidu leaped up on his bull's back, grasping him by the horns, leaped up on the bull's back, as they later on did in Crete at the bull games. And while riding on his back, seizing his tail in one hand and the horns in the other, and then Gilgamesh cut into his throat and heart with a sword, killed the bull of heaven with a great crash, and dragged him into the city, adding to their great accomplishments. And Ishtar was even more incensed because now they had killed this semi-divine being that had been sent down by the gods. And the gods sat in council. And the oldest of the gods, Anu, said, "They have killed the forest giant Humbaba. They have killed the bull of heaven. One of them must die. Let it be Gilgamesh, the one who cut down the cedar trees." And Enlil, the god of the sky god, said, No, Gilgamesh is my special protege, and it should be Enkidu who gets killed. Enkidu saw this whole scene, this god council, in a dream. And Shamash said, I don't think you should kill them at all, because after all, I helped them out. They came to me, offered me sacrifice, and I gave them allies. And Enlil got enraged at Shamash. See, the gods get enraged at each other. And said, yeah, well, you're like, you just go down there and hang out with those humans all the time. You're a real troublemaker yourself. So the decision was Enkidu was going to die. And Enkidu, actually there's an extraordinary story too, but even before he has this dream, where the goddess Ishtar goes up on the city walls and complains and inveighs against them. They've killed not only the forest giant, now they've killed this bull of heaven, this special animal that she sent down. And they're both defiant, and they say basically, fuck off, we don't care about you. That wasn't inscribed in the tablets. I added that in. And Enkidu, it says, took the right thigh of the bull, which might actually be a gloss for the penis of the bull. We don't know. It says, took the right thigh of the bull, and hurled it at the goddess, and said, this is what we'll do to you if we catch you. So they were naughty boys, to say the least, in relationship to the gods. They defied the gods. They insult the gods. This is what we still do. All the naughty boys in the big companies and the government. So after it was decided by the gods in council that Enkidu should die, Enkidu became sick and ill and started having these hallucinations, and had a vision of the land of the dead, where all the great kings and emperors, people of power and the priests and all were wandering around in this dusty gray world with no light, and sitting at tables with dust and eating food with dust, and the land of the dead. And he had other dreams, and he had visions, and he thought about his animal friends that he had left long ago, and he cursed, as I told you, the hunter, and he cursed the woman. And the god came and said, no, don't curse the hunter, don't curse the woman, they gave you this. Then Gilgamesh was weeping and saying, oh my God, what am I going to do? I'm just going crazy, I can't stand this, you're my best friend, you're my closest, think of all the adventures we've had together, and all the good times we've shared, and we're so close, and I'm going to miss you so terrible. I just can't tolerate this. What am I going to do? And Enkidu gets sicker and sicker, and he has this fever, and he's hallucinating, and he's raving, and 7 days, and 8 days, and 10 days, and then finally he dies. And Gilgamesh goes crazy and tears off his hair, his clothes, and starts wandering through the wilderness, crying his name. And Enkidu, my brother, my friend, my other self, has died. What shall I do? I must go on the great journey to find the secret of life and death and what this is all about. And that's another whole part of the story, which I'll leave for now, having told you the story of how Enkidu, the wild man, came to the city through the woman. How Enkidu and Gilgamesh together as hero warriors fought and slew and cut down the forest and killed the spirit guardian of the forest. And how Enkidu and Gilgamesh insulted and rebuffed the goddess. And how then the price was paid and that the animal part of the man dies. Eventually the man himself dies also. The animal part, the body part, dies first. And there's one counterpart I want to mention to you of this experience that Gilgamesh has in relationship to the goddess. Why does Gilgamesh say to the goddess, I don't want to be your lover because you're such a faithless goddess, look to the other people. What is that? And it came to me that that experience is analogous to an experience that I had in the desert when I first, on a wilderness vision quest, when I first realized that Mother Nature, so-called, does not give a shit about me personally, does not care for me personally, that I can be wiped out by a falling rock, a sudden drop in temperature if I'm unprepared, or losing my way, a landslide, any number of things in which my personal existence, my personal accomplishments, my personal happiness, security, well-being, recognition, reputation, none of those mean a whit for nature. That's why the limitation of so if you try to have a personal relationship like a lover to nature, I love nature, sort of romantic ideal, you're likely to get clobbered, you're likely to get killed, because nature, as Maria Gimbutas called out, the old goddess is not really a mother goddess. That's the limitation of that mother metaphor for nature. It's an okay metaphor in one sense because it indicates we're a family. But it has a limitation because a mother is not like that. It means that you don't really take care. We are responsible for our own relationship to nature and for impeccability in our relationship with nature. We have to be observant. We have to be attentive. We have to study nature so we know our part in it and how we can survive and live in an adapted way with nature. Otherwise, we get so that to me is the insight that's behind Gilgamesh's rejection. It's a kind of a petulant, spoiled adolescent kid, who's rejected by the girl when he wants his first date kind of thing. But that's the experience behind it. It's the basic recognition of that nature is personally neutral towards us. I mean, she's not against us either. That's a misinterpretation of Gilgamesh. She's not out to do us in. Nature is doing her own thing. We are part of it. But it's not for us. So neither for us nor against us. She's neutral. But the petulant male adolescent who gets his ego bent out of shape says, oh, you've rejected me. I don't want to be your lover. I can't be your lover because look what happened to all these other guys. But we all get killed by nature in the end. Maybe by other people, but that's nature too, isn't it? So the story of how Gilgamesh Enkidu comes to the city, how the human makes peace with the animal wild man within, they become companions, which is the true relationship for them to have, how they then get overbearing and lose it by going and killing the forest, guardian spirit, and then by rejecting the goddess and nature in a personal way, rather than understanding their proper role in relationship to nature. And then the final illusion, the last story, is that Gilgamesh thinks, well, he should be able to do something that will allow him to be immortal like the gods, and he has to learn that lesson too, that that's not going to happen. So that's the end of this part of the story of the hero, the goddess, the hero, and the wild man. Oh, hawk.
Why don't we... And all myths that are authentic and haven't been rewritten for daytime television maintain a kind of dreamlike, surreal quality. And so I'd like to tell you a story that I came upon a few months ago and was delighted. And I tell it to you in the hope that you can perhaps help me to understand it. like all good stories, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But I felt that there must be something important in it because it was very easy to memorize. So that clued me to the fact that there must be something in it. And this story comes from that ultimately pivotal moment in Western civilization when the last outpost of the goddess culture, which was Crete, Minoan Crete, fell and was in the process of falling to the pirate paternalists of Mycenae, who, with advances in shipbuilding and an economic base built on grain, were beginning to conquer the eastern Mediterranean, and one by one the last bastions of the goddess religion were falling. There were also great earthquakes in the eastern Mediterranean at this time, which also contributed to the disruption of this civilization. And the story that I want to tell is a story that occurs from the very oldest stratum of Greek mythology. This is not about the pantheon of classical or even Doric Greece. This is an older story, Mycenaean, perhaps older than that, going back even to the pastoralists coming out of Africa and into the Fertile Crescent. It's a story set in a setting which is probably familiar to most of you, although this story is only told in Pausanias and alluded to in Herodotus, so it is not a story that even classicists are too familiar with. Robert Graves, in his 4-volume study of Greek mythology, gives it only passing reference. You may recall that King Minos was the king of Crete, and that he was most famous for having built a labyrinth in which to house the Minotaur. And I'm sure you know the story of the traversing of the labyrinth. And perhaps you know that King Minos built the labyrinth, had need of it, because his wife, Queen Pasiphae, was an extremely sensuous and experimentally minded young woman. And she became so interested in the sexual habits of cattle that she had Icarus, the craftsman who was later to break out of this scene on the Daedalus, the guy who was going to break out of this scene later on the first flying machine. She had him fashion for her an artificial cow in which she hid in order to have sexual union with the bulls in the royal flock. And out of this hanky-panky came the Minotaur. And her husband, trying to cover up this series of faux pas, built the labyrinth, installed the Minotaur in the labyrinth, and they grew older and did less swinging and began to settle down. But then comes the story I want to tell, which is a few years later, the king and the queen, apparently under quite normal conditions, conceived a child who was in due time born. And this child's name was Glaucus. Glaucus means blue-gray, and is to this day a term preserved in taxonomy to describe the blue-gray color typical of the peyote cactus and of the bruising reaction of psilocybin mushrooms. And young Glaucus had the run of the royal palace at Knossos. And in his 6th year, he was exploring the pantries of the palace, and he discovered a huge urn filled with honey. And he took the lid off the honey urn and was reaching into it and fell into the honey and was drowned and died there. And no one knew what had become of the son of the king and the queen. And there was tumult, as you can imagine, in the court. And eventually Queen Pasiphae, in a state of complete hysterical distraction, went to the great seer who advised the king's generals and the king's weather makers. And she said, you must find our son. And the seer looked into the surface of oils poured on water and burned hyssop leaves. And he said, my magic is not sufficient to find your son, but I can lead you to one who can find your son. He said, the person, and this is the part of the myth which is so bizarre that you suspect that there must be textual corruption or some kind of misunderstanding, because it's so weird what follows. The seer said, the person who can lead you to your son is that person who can compose the most apt simile on the tricolored cow in your herds. What the tricolored cow is, what kind of code language we're dealing with, can only be a matter of conjecture. But obviously the story at this point is couched in a secret language which conveyed meaning only to the initiates. So the king and the queen commanded each citizen of the principality to appear before them and compose a simile on the tricolored cow. And there was a man there, a minor philosopher, whose name was Polyeidos. And Polyeidos, you only have to have spent 2 weeks in Greek before you transferred out to something a little less horrifying to know that Polyeidos means many ideas. So Polyeidos, the man of many ideas, went before the court and he proposed a simile, which, according to the account of Pausanias, was brilliant. He doesn't preserve it, and hence it's lost forever. But whatever this simile was, it carried the day. And Polyeidos was actually a very humble man, a minor healer and magician. And he was puzzled that out of all the people in the kingdom, he had been chosen, or he had, by fate, been singled out as the one who could solve this extremely racking dilemma of the lost son for the king and queen. And he said to the king, I have no idea how to go about this, how to find your son. And the queen flew into a rage and said, he should be sealed into a crypt with the body of our son. And he can come out when he comes out with our son alive. And so Polyeidos was seized by force. And notice now the motifs of incarceration, the dark night of the slab. And as Polyeidos sat there bewailing his fate and rending his clothes and calling out on the gods to help him, a snake entered the chamber through some unseen tiny chink. And the snake approached the corpse of the child lying in a dripping pool of presumably dark attic honey on the polished stone of the sarcophagi. And Polyeidos emerged out of his reverie and struck out at the snake and killed it because he was afraid it would violate the body of the child. And then, seeing that the snake was dead, he went back to his reverie. And a few minutes later, a second snake appeared and came to the body of the first snake and reacted very violently. And before Polyeidos could move to catch it, quick as a wink, it was across the room and lost through a small aperture in the floor. And hours passed, and the depth of Polyeidos' despair grew and multiplied as he realized the hopelessness of his situation. And then, suddenly, the second snake appeared again. And this time, it was carrying in its mouth a branch of a small herb. And it approached the corpse of its companion, and regurgitated the branch into the mouth of the dead snake. And the dead snake was revived, and the two snakes went away. And Polyidus was struck dumb with amazement. And he called to his jailers, and he described this herb to them, which was well known to him for its use in other medical matters. And the herb was brought to him, and he chewed it up, and he regurgitated it into the mouth of the corpse of young Glaucus. And the child was revived. And Polyidus' ass was saved. So he emerged, and the king and the queen were jubilant, and the court was jubilant, and the king said, "You can have anything that you wish." And Polyidus, who was actually a foreigner in Crete, said, "I want to journey to my homeland. I want to return to my homeland." And King Minos was on the brink of granting the boon when Queen Pasiphae intervened and whispered in his ear and said, "You cannot allow a magician of this power to leave the kingdom. We must somehow gain his knowledge before we allow him to depart from us." And so King Minos backtracked and made a different deal and said, "You can return to your homeland, but first you must teach all your magical arts to my son Glaucus, who you have resurrected." And so Polyidus, not liking it, but seeing the power of the king, acceded to the demand. And over the course of many years, he taught all his shamanic and magical arts to Glaucus, and he schooled him in all of the esoteric knowledge that had made Polyidus the unique person able to find the lost child. And finally, he went to the king and said, "I have taught all I know to your son. Now fulfill your promise and allow me to leave your kingdom." And so the king was agreed. And on the appointed day of departure, a royal retinue accompanied Polyidus to the quay where he was to grab the boat out to Syracuse. And they were embracing, and the last goodbyes were being said. And finally, it only remained for Polyidus to make his departure to Glaucus. And he approached Glaucus, and he said, as my pupil, as the one that I have initiated, I have one last request. It is that now at our farewell, you spit into my mouth. And Glaucus thought it was a bizarre request, but he did as his master bade him, and Polyidus boarded the ship, and they cast off and sailed away. And as the royal family was standing on the quay looking out to sea, Glaucus realized that all the magical information that had been given to him over the years had been contained in the glob of spittle, and that the master had reclaimed his knowledge and sailed away. So that's the story of Glaucus and Polyidus.
One sort of funny part is that in the original, at first you said they couldn't find the body, and then you said they knew where the body was and needed to revive him.
Oh yeah, I blew the story. Polyidus, once chosen, he dreamed and saw the body in the honey, but they were so flipped out that the kid was dead that the fact that he had found the body didn't buy him much slack. Yes, thank you for clarifying that. Now, the reason, let me say a little bit about it, is a very interesting story. I found it while I was searching for proto-Hellenic myths related to mushrooms. And there's something funny going on in this story. The fact that the blue-gray child is preserved in the honey and then is resurrected through the intercession of another herb, an herb known to the snake. And recall from the Genesis myth that the snake is always the keeper of the vegetable secrets. It was the snake who had the inner skinny on the flora and fauna of Eden. And so the snake comes bearing information that then concerns this herb of immortality and the ability to resurrect the dead. And it shows, I think, the very late persistence of these Paleolithic themes of shamanic power carried and transmitted through plants. If any of you have any other insight into this, why perhaps in the afternoon.
Glaucus may have been eaten a mushroom and gone into some kind of coma state where he appeared dead, and then the task was to revive him. So they found an herb that restores people who are apparently dead. In the Gilgamesh story, there's also an herb of immortality that the snake absconds with. And the snakes have always been especially credited with knowing the secret of regeneration because of their sloughing their skin and all that.
Well, you know, people in Mexico who go to Huatla and places like that and collect the mushroom, the on-the-road, old-style way of preserving the mushrooms was to put them in honey. And it turns into a totally black mess. It turns into the alchemical prima materia. It turns into the exudate of the grave. But if you have the courage to eat it, it is then reborn inside of you. And honey, the role of honey as any of you have read Levi-Strauss, Honey and Ashes and The Raw and the Cooked, know that, this is a symbol of semen, of sunlight, of sweetness. I mean, it's a very rich kind of symbol. There are even, it's reputed, hallucinogenic honeys in the Amazon. This is a whole unexplored area where nobody has ever been able to walk into a laboratory and slam down a quart jar of hallucinogenic honey, but there are persistent reports filtering back from wild-eyed travelers.
Remember the microphone.
The metaphor of honey, the manas from heaven, yes.
Do you recommend preserving mushrooms in honey?
No, I don't recommend preserving mushrooms in honey if you have a good freeze dryer and modern refrigeration. But otherwise, you see, the honey draws the moisture out and it like candies it and crystallizes it and makes it impervious. Honey is highly antibiotic. Nothing rots that is immersed.
You have to eat all the honey? Terence,
Yeah.
make sure that they actually talk into the microphone.
Yes.
These questions.
Mr. Coffey is going to... You had a story to tell. No? Oh, I tailored myself to your needs, sir. Now I have nothing to say.
Come on, you can't back out. Yes, I can.
Yes, he can, as a matter of fact. Well,
It's not a story, but it's sort of a joke.
She has a joke.
a joke.
It's a deathbed joke. When I was deathing my father, a couple of days before he died, he told me a dream. He woke up and he said that he was sitting on the top of the peaks, and the elders came and gave him the beads, and they contained the secrets of the universe, and they went through the rosary of all the beads and showed him all the secrets of the universe. And he understood that he was going to die, and that he'd been given this gift before he died. And then they left him there, telling him that they would see him. And he looked down in the beads, and he couldn't remember any of the secrets of the universe.
Yes, well, there's something about dreams where meaning, puns, or some great truth is portrayed, but it can never be quite brought back. And it seems simple, silly, profound, but mostly difficult to remember. And a friend of mine, the closest to my mind that anybody ever came to capturing this was a friend of mine told me about a dream he had that was very complex and many, many things happened. But in the final scene, there was a raft covered with Edwardian furniture and naked mermaids. and it was floating out to sea, and the mermaids were waving to my friend who stood on the beach, and the last thing he heard them call out to him was, "Deja vu! Deja vu!" He said, "This sounds like it means something." Well, anyone who wishes to say, I mean, you don't have to feel constrained. You have to feel constrained. No, I'm sure.
The American Buddhist says that snakes are the goddess. That any symbol of the snake that you see in archaic something or other is the goddess.
Well, too bad Maria Gimbutas can't mud wrestle Sigmund Freud. Sure, the caduceus.
I'd like to invite people also in terms of telling stories. Also, dreams, I think, would be, often do contain good stories. And you might search your memory, particularly for dreams. I mean, I have a personal interest. I think it kind of ties in with the theme of this weekend and this theme of the wild man or the wild woman, the wild creature, the half animal, half human part of our own nature. If you ever had a dream that seemed to be about such a being, this would be a very significant dream, very centrally related to what we're talking about here.
There was a book published very recently that I enjoy plugging because the guy is so perverse. And, he's a post-structuralist, Marxist, Jacques Derrida, labor organizer, rationalist type. But he wrote an amazing book about ayahuasca called Shamanism, Colonialism, and the Wild Man. And if you want to be plunged into the world of real shamanism as it is practiced today among very sophisticated people, I mean, this guy got it. His name is Michael Taussig, and you have to take off your hat to this guy because being an anthropologist at the University of Chicago and a Marxist, he took it over and over and over again, not sipping it. He actually, just got flattened with these people and talks about it and just throws out the gauntlet to orthodox anthropology. And he's no true believer. This is no Carlos Castaneda. This is somebody very few of us here would actually be comfortable with, because you can tell this guy is abrasive, thinks everybody else is a moron, thinks people who hear voices should see a psychiatrist, and yet you get the whole thing. It's all there. Shamanism, colonialism, and the wild man.
And the thing that I got from that book was that what he points out is that the people in the Amazon region, having experienced 250 years of savage colonial oppression, are returning to ayahuasca to heal themselves and to to retreat, as it were, to restore themselves and to heal themselves from the outrageous wounds and humiliations imposed on them by the colonial robber barons that run the rubber plantations down there, who regularly torture and massacre the Indians just for sport, and convert them to slavery, basically. And so the ayahuasca is healing and also reconnecting them with their original existence in the jungle, which is fits with his Marxist analysis of the major human cultural patterns being a reaction against economic oppression and so on. And the role of hallucinogens there there is other evidence for that in Africa, for example, where the tribe that uses the iboga root, from which ibogaine is derived, are the Fang people in the Congo area, and they themselves say in their visions and their descriptions of their journeys with it, which they say puts you in touch with your ancestors, and they acknowledge their own ancestors who went on had to do these great migrations to get away from Muslim and Christian soldier armies and so forth, and credit and even another people, the Pygmy people, who lived even further in the forest. So the Fang are village dwellers, and so they credit the Iboka And the use of the Iboka, having learned that from the pygmies, who showed them this is how you live in the forest, which is the earlier stratum, really the wild, even more wild than they were. I mean, from our point of view, they'd be wild, but this is even further, more nature, deep forest. So they learned from them how to reconnect with that living source in the deep forest and at the same time escape the depredations of the colonialist oppressors.
It's interesting, in the case of Iboka, there's no known reference to it before 1850. So this is like a use of a hallucinogen in a tribal context for which there is no evidence of great age at all. The peyote use over a widespread area is also similar. The older stratum of archaeological digs in the southwest seems to indicate that peyote use came in fairly late. This brings up a point that I wanted to make in discussing and imaging the figure of the shaman, which is not to get into a naive cult of the wild man. Some of you may know the book The Rio Tigre and Beyond by Manuel Cordova Rios, or it's by F. Bruce Lamb, but it's about Manuel Cordova Rios, who was a great ayahuasquero. And he describes going on curare collecting and rosewood collecting expeditions into really uncontacted tribal areas in the Amazon. And there he would meet people brewing ayahuasca, completely bare-assed, scarified, hunter-gathering types. And they didn't know how to do it. And it was weak. He took it with them, and it was just a stone drag. So if you know the book, you know that he himself had this history of involvement with ayahuasca. So he made it for them the way he thought it should be made and showed them how to make it. And they had no resistance at all. They said, "My God, you really know how to do this. Our whole culture will now be different. You know, we've just been making weak tea." So there is this thing about how the real access to the shamanic mystery is a shifting doorway. You never know where you're going to find it. When we were in the Amazon in '83, we were dealing with pretty authentic tribal people and asking them about these orally active DMT drugs. And the best they could do was to say, well, I saw my grandfather make it a couple of times before he died, and he died 20 years ago, but I think I could make it. The tradition was just in the act of fading away. But then, among the pharmacology students of the University Nacional de Peru, we found that with the help of Harvard Museum botanical leaflets, they had reconstructed these aboriginal drugs so that they were extremely powerful and hit the mark every time. So shamanism is not the depth of a shaman's authenticity is not measured by the authenticity of the culture. The woman or man who is a shaman, it depends on their unique personality. My brother once suggested that a good definition for a shaman would be an extra-environmental, and that this is the attitude to cultivate. Be a stranger everywhere. Always stand on the outside. Always be the alien. And you will have the proper attitude for furthering in yourself the tendencies that make you into a person who sees deeply into reality. Another way of thinking about a shaman is it's a person, this is the definition I created when my son was much younger, and he asked me, what is a shaman? And I said, a shaman is a person who knows how the world really works. And this is the task of every one of us, to find out how does it really work? How does it really work? you inherit always a cultural model, which is relatively trivial and idiotic, and in all complex situations will fail you. So how does the world really work? And to what degree does the cultural model stand in the way rather than serve as a springboard too? In the case of our own culture, I think quite a bit.
This thing about the disappearing knowledge reminds me of something I wanted to share with you too. Is that some of you may know this woman called Anne Armstrong, who's a very, very gifted seeress, psychic we call her, or intuitive some call her now, seeress, somebody who can tune into personal and meta-personal kind of larger cultural visions of the past and the future. So she was once asked in a context of a small conference about the history and future potentials of psychedelic plants and visionary plants. And she got from her vision that said something like, well, these kinds of psychoactive visionary plants have been used by humans since the most ancient times for the purpose of helping humans come closer to God, basically, using kind of God language, or we might say in a more abstract way, come closer to a real understanding of the evolutionary design of life on this planet and what our role really is. So the kind of role of psychedelics that we've been talking about here. And but what happens, and that the intelligences, the conscious beings that inhabit these plant forms, plant species, reach out to the human world, essentially, to establish this kind of cooperative, symbiotic, mutually supportive evolutionary relationship. But then if humans start forgetting what the purpose of that is and start misusing the plants for their own personal purposes, then the plant spirits withdraw. And they withdraw into the recesses of history. So they become inaccessible. Like Terence was saying, the knowledge is lost because the people are no longer using it for the purpose for which the plants really want them to be used. You know, this is like really treating the plant spirits as equal intelligences to us, not as something to be used, but as something to be shared and communicated, exchanged. The knowledge becomes forgotten, like with the mushrooms. They were regarded as a myth up until the 50s. You know, still in the 20s and 30s, there were anthropological texts that referred to the magic mushroom as a myth. I mean, a fairy tale, in other words, a non-true story, a fantasy. And until the 50s, until Watson rediscovered Maria Sabina up in the mountains of Oaxaca, brewing and doing the mushroom velada, that was the belief. Or another way they become inaccessible, you know, the elusive ergot beverage was lost. Of course, it was suppressed. The Somer thing was suppressed, or lost, or both. And or they become, another way they become inaccessible is by being made illegal, prohibited, as happened with LSD and all these others very, very quickly. See, becomes accessible. Same with MDMA. MDMA was used like LSD was for about 10 years by therapists and serious people wanting to use it to explore the potentials of the human mind. Then at a certain point, a certain threshold gets crossed. People start realizing the potential for making profit by distributing it to large numbers of people who otherwise wouldn't really have any interest in it. It's manufactured not for the purpose of helping people expand their consciousness, but for the purpose of making certain people rich. Then it becomes illegal immediately. And then it becomes illegal, then you got the various maniacs, the perverts, the exploiters, the barbarians, the people like Manson, and who completely misuse it, pervert it for the opposite of what it was originally intended to be, and it becomes essentially inaccessible.
It's interesting to try and understand how this kind of knowledge could ever be lost. I mean, like Soma is a good example. I mean, the whole of the Rig Veda, especially the 9th mandala of the Rig Veda, is just this ecstatic hymn to Soma, to some kind of intoxicating plant juice thing that was expressed in a series of pumps and grinders that was the central mystery of this invading Indo-European civilization for a couple of thousand years. And then around 1000 BC, for inexplicable reasons, even the knowledge of what this plant was seemed to be lost. Well, how can such information that is so central to a full experiencing of human potential, once found, ever be forgotten? And I think that the only scenario that I've been able to come up with that would account for something like that is if you have a visionary plant and it's used by the population, but then you specialize and create a professional class that uses it. And then that professional class makes it illegal for all other classes. And then the professional class, which is using this entheogen, coincidentally is also the ruling class. Well, then when the lower echelons of society have had enough of being ruled, then there are slave revolts and popular uprisings, and the priestly class that held this secret as its own source of power is probably wiped out to the last bald-headed priest, and with them dies the information. So the holding close of the information is the first step toward losing it.
Well, and I think the other aspect of that is the active suppression by the priest caste of the knowledge. They don't, and the same pattern exactly happened in Europe with all the witches, the herbs preserved by the witches. The ruling priests of the church, and in India, I think something similar may have happened. The priests always want people, like Blake says, the priesthood abstracts the deities and says, we have a special relationship to this deity. And we are the ones, we're the experts, we'll intercede for you, we'll be the intermediary. You talk to the deities and they'll talk to you through us. We'll tell you what the gods say, because we have this superior connection to them, and you do what they say, and you pay us. You support us. That's the deal. And the people buy the deal, and then part of the deal consists, and then you can't take the medicine, because the medicine would make the people communicate with the god directly. That's what the peyote Indians say. A white man goes to church and talks about God, and an Indian goes to the peyote teepee and takes peyote and talks with God. So the priesthood immediately, they don't want people to have mystical experiences, whether with mushrooms, soma, herbs, datura, no matter what it is. And then they want the power and the wealth. They control the power and the wealth anymore. Finally, they said they don't need to take the mushrooms themselves either. Because actually, if they continue to take the mushroom, they would, or the psychedelic, they would have to question their own power trip. So they rather want to maintain the power trip rather than constantly question it. So they suppress it. I think the only way soma could have been wiped out is by systematic suppression.
It's
like
all there in Genesis.
Yeah.
I mean, basically the story of this struggle over access to a plant and the first prohibition. You can do anything you want, but do not eat of the fruit of this plant. And then the tree of knowledge, and the other source is saying, you will become as him. You will know your true condition in the cosmos. Well, is it that you will know your true condition in the cosmos, or is it that you will be cast down into an unending and eternal hell unto the 1000th generation? This is essentially Nancy Reagan's position. So the issue is knowledge. The true, if you look for an archetype of the shaman in the Western pantheon, the archetype of the psychedelic user, it has to be Prometheus. It is Prometheus who steals the fire from divinity and carries illumination down to the human species.
In a fennel stalk.
And for that, must suffer the most outlandish torture and indignity ever dreamed up by the Western imagination.
I have a story.
Okay, and then we'll break. Get your mic and do your thing.
Okay, so I want to change from the image of the primordial man, the sort of primitive man of nature, who is the other half of ourselves, to the primordial man in the sense of the wizard or the genie or the excellence.
The immortal.
The immortal one in us. And in this story, his name is Khizr, who is a Muslim figure who kind of runs around on the edge of reality, rather like Elijah for the Jews. Elijah was taken up in a chariot of fire and never died. And and so he's always present, and he can come to the rabbis and sit after midnight and stand in front of their desk and teach out little pieces of scripture to them. And so Khizr comes to people in their dreams or in vision. And in the Hindu tradition, Babaji is this man. So the story starts with an ordinary man living in a small village on the frontier of Afghanistan and southern Russia there. And he's the official in charge of collecting taxes, the weights and measures. So people who come through, they go through him. And he has a perfectly nice life with a wife and a child and so on. And one night, in the middle of the night, comes to the foot of his bed, this figure, Khizr Nabi. And he's dressed in an emerald green cloak with an emerald green pointed hat. And they have gold and silver stars and sickle moons embroidered upon the cloak and the hat. And he has a long pointed grey beard and piercing green eyes, and these eyebrows curl up at the edge. And he says to the little man, meet me at the river in 3 days at sunset. And the little man is totally trembling, and he wakes up in the morning and goes to his little tax office, and he tells the big boss who's in charge of him, excuse me, but in 3 days' time I have to leave and I'm quitting the job now and I can't do anything about it. And they say, and the rumor spreads through the village immediately, he's gone mad. He's gone crazy. And his wife comes to hear of it because he doesn't have the courage to tell her himself, and, oh dear, he's gone crazy, what can we do? Perhaps we didn't feed him the right food, or whatever else he takes. But anyway, 3 days later, he's standing at sunset at the edge of the river, and he sees far upriver coming towards him this man with a great emerald green cloak and the tall hat and the pointed beard. And they meet and they acknowledge each other, and Khizr says, jump in the river. So, shall I continue?
Yes.
Oh. So he jumps in the river. Robert Bly taught us that when the storyteller stops, then you're supposed to encourage him to go on, otherwise he doesn't know it. Maybe he's boring you, you know? So, oh, good. That's what I was doing to you. You're trying to encourage you, you know, just in the traditional way to make you know that we love your story. So he jumps in the river, and fortunately he can paddle a little bit and swim a little bit, so he's in the river and it's carrying him, and it's nearly dawn when a small fishing boat comes by and sees him and says, oh, you're nearly at the mouth of the river, it's dangerous here, and they take him up onto the boat, and they take him to shore where they have a small hut, palapa they call it, yes, and they make him help them with the nets, and they feed him, of course, from the fish that they've caught, and then they take him out with them in the early morning, and they teach him how to read the stars, to know what time of the night it is and when to set out for the fishing. And they teach him about the tides and about the seasons. And then one night he's sleeping in his little hammock in the fishing village, and who should come by but Khizr Nabi, who says, leave here before dawn, walk over those mountains, and see what happens. Shall I continue?
Yes, continue.
So he comes to a green valley over the mountains, and he sees some men harvesting and putting the wheat up on a cart and carrying it to the farmhouse and coming back for more, and he stands by the road watching them, and they call him and they say, hey, this is harvest time, come and help us. So he helps, and he loads the hay, and then in the evening he's in the farmhouse and they sit him down at the table with all of them, and the next morning he's up for breakfast, and it's the farmer's daughter who brings him the porridge and the cereal and everything, and it's looking quite nice, and he learns about planting and about the seasons and the autumn and the springtime and how to keep the seeds. And he's quite interested in the farmer's daughter after all, and life is not so bad, and there's cream and there's honey. And then who should come in the middle of the night but Chezer, and says, without saying goodbye to these people because you like them, before the dawn comes, leave and go to that far city and become a dealer in furs and skins.
Go on.
Yes, each time he gets right up in the middle of the night and rushes off with nothing. They'd given him a small salary. So he had to take the money that he'd earned and go and set himself up. So he goes there and he buys some skins, and soon, because of his non-attachment and because he didn't really do this out of ambition, the gods smile on him, even though nature is indifferent. Sometimes if your mood is right, then those nymphets and other devas and goddesses who inhabit nature can actually help us and give us the illusion, I think, that nature is on our side, even if it really isn't.
Yes.
So he has this illusionary experience and becomes quite rich, and one of the main merchant ladies of the city takes an interest in him, and they decide that they're going to buy a house together and then improve their investments and share their knowledge of dealing in things. And they're putting their money together and discussing this, and they found the right house, and who should come in the middle of the night but Chezer Nabi with his emerald green cloak and all his paraphernalia, and said to him, give me the money you've earned, which is the part I really like about this story, and go to that small village in the mountains and apprentice yourself to the potter. Or is it the greengrocer? I always change this part of the story. Anyway, should we go on?
Yes.
Yeah.
So he goes, he gives the money to Chezer, and he goes to the small village in the mountains, and he apprentices himself to the greengrocer, and people come to buy their vegetables and so on, and they talk to the greengrocer, and they pay him, and they talk to the greengrocer's assistant, and then they go away and they feel nice. And then some of the ladies in the village have a headache, and they go to the greengrocer, and they come back from the greengrocer, and their headache's gone. And then someone's sick, and they go to the greengrocer shop, and he isn't there, and they just speak to the assistant, and they go away and they're not sick anymore. And so this becomes a byword in the village, and finally the leaders of the village come to talk to the person, and then even the scholars from other places come. And they examine him, and they ask him to tell them what it is that has brought him to this deep knowledge, and which marvelous teachers he has had, and which theological schools he's studied in. And then he tells them the story of his life. I don't know if you remember it. I could tell it again. Would you like me to tell it? No. And so they make up some story, which makes it very important, his life. And they say, well, he's really hiding the truth from us, and he must have studied with this great Peter and with this great teacher and had these tremendous initiatic experiences. And it's simply called The Story of the Man with the Inexplicable Life. And my question out of it is how the primordial man and the kind of alchemist, how they play against each other and with each other in our struggle to become more than just our human self, to discover our natural primordial self and also to discover this godlike self.
Well, anyone who's written a curriculum vitae has grappled with that problem. Okay, gang.
Oh.
That's it. We'll meet here at 3.
One small announcement.
So it is not a metaphor that we are in a state of symbiotic abandonment to our mother. It isn't a symbolic statement at all. It is simply a true statement that we are so far out into the history game that we don't understand this, that our ennui, our existential angst is all because we don't know jack shit about what's going on. And the reason we don't is because we have accepted prohibitions against finding out what's going on. We are infantile, as a matter of fact. Our whole spiritual engine of transcendence is infantile. It rests on the daddy figure, who is the priest, the guru, the wise man, some beady-eyed character from Bengal or elsewhere who's going to just straighten us all out. There is a complete kind of wrong-headedness that we have inherited as part of our historical legacy. It's that we do not value direct experience. We do not trust ourselves. We do not pay attention to the immediate input from the living world. We are always casting away from ourselves. What do the experts say? What did Buddha say? What did Plato say? What did somebody on the other side of the world? What are they saying now? We give ourselves away. And the reason is because we are bereft. You know that phenomenon of the 40-year-old guy with the sports car and 3 marriages behind him? This guy is desperate. He is bereft. I always think of that amazing phrase in Lady Chatterley's Lover, where Constance Chatterley faces the fact that she is, as she says in the book, to be had for the taking. And to some degree, we all have reached such a state of spiritual bereavement and abandonment that we are to be had for the taking. And this makes us susceptible. It makes us marks, to use a word that's dear to William Burroughs. Shamanism is an effort to get outside the carny midway, to actually walk between the tents and to discover the cool night that is going on away from the sound of the change makers and the barkers. And this, it has to do, I maintain, and I become less and less tolerant of any other view, which is either a sign that I'm slowly losing my mind, or I'm slowly eventually I'll just be like John Lilly, I just won't give a shit, really say what I think. But I really believe that authentic shamanism is psychedelic shamanism. And then people say, and nobody's said it yet, but it's okay to say it, can't you get there some other fasting? That I'm not saying that you can't push consciousness around, and I'm not saying that you cannot induce psycholytic states of self-recognition, states of abandonment of neurotic behavior patterns and that sort of thing. Certainly these things happen, but this informing impossible mystery, this thing which need not exist at all, so far as we can tell. It is entirely a gratuitous mystery, this informing sense of the other that approaches us with poetry and jeweled machines and visionary vistas of the far future and lost races in space and biological destinies possible but untried. That is not approachable any other way. And I think, that all this lineage mumbo-jumbo and the close holding of secrets means you don't have a strong hand. If you're holding your hand close to your chest, it's because you're afraid to play it. And the shamanism that is happening at the most primitive cultural level is shamanism that is willing to show its hand. I mean, they don't tell you that you're not pure enough or celibate enough or haven't mastered textual proficiency enough. They just say, yes, come with us into the woods and we will show you what we know. And what we know is that we don't know nothing. And this is how we found that out. We found it out by putting ourselves at the mercy of something that we absolutely cannot understand, something which cannot be boiled down to serve ideology. This horse cannot be broken. Any priest who tries to ride it will be thrown for a loop. Any politician who tries to ride it will be trampled beneath it. It is a true mystery. And the male ego, that reductionist, Newtonian, Cartesian, positivist approach, always pushes for closure. There is never satisfaction unless there is explanation. And yet explanation is a fool's game. Anybody can create an explanation. The history of thought is the history of one cockeyed explanation after another, which is immediately perceived as ludicrous once it becomes outmoded. So the mystery is not an unsolved problem. It is a true mystery. Nobody knows what is going on. I don't think any tradition has taken the measure of this or operates in the light of it. The people who actually handle the molten alchemical ore that pours out of the furnaces of hyperspace have very little to say about it, have no interpretation to offer. It's the public relations people and the priestcraft people and the people who have a book they're selling. They are just full of information, explanation, denunciation, adoration, so forth, and so on. But the people who stand close to the mystery are silent. And what I would like to put across, and what I'm always trying to put across, and what is very hard to put across even though we say it over and over again, is how real what we're talking about is. It is real. It can just shake your teeth out. It is very fine to sit under the teaching tree and talk about psychedelic drugs. Do you know how much this is like being smashed on a psychedelic drug? Not at all. Not one iota. Because what is required in the actual confrontation of the thing is that all this theory, all this tradition, all this self-examination is brought in to the focus of the moment. It is existentially real. You are being tried and you are being tested by a thing and an agency that you cannot know. And this is very different from getting a laugh from an audience or a paycheck from an institution or your book reviewed in the newspaper. That is all dross and foolishness, because we all know that there are weasels everywhere and that your position in human society is no indication of your existential validity. But if you can pass through the fire of the psychedelic experience, and it is a fire, the hexagram Li, the clinging, is the sign of the psychedelic experience. It is the noetic fire. It's the fire that descended on Pentecost and gave language to the apostles. If you can pass through that fire, then you have made a pact outside of history, outside of the validations and value systems of men and women. You have found authentic being. And it's a great challenge, a great controversy. People, react differently. They want to preserve this particular tradition which mitigates against it, that particular tradition which mitigates against it. The fact is, we can only say what we know. And I diligently sought existential validity in the various rumored Sothic oases in the landscape of human aspirations, such as yoga, such as sitting, such as, and it's just a matter of shopping around, and finding out what actually sets your knees knocking, what actually makes tears of joy run down your face spontaneously, what actually can make you grovel and plead for mercy. And it is this force, this real invocation of real spirit. It is a dark night of the soul. It is an ecstasy, apotheosis, apokatastasis. It even happens outside of Greek. It is pure challenge met and overcome, pure self-authentication. And in a world where we are just buffeted, used, set against one another, misled, misconstrued, lied to, and controlled, nevertheless, you can just push between the tents of Carnival Row and walk out into the woods, and there you find the spiritual life waiting. There you find the limpid, sophic waters of the Tao that were always there. And it's a matter of courage, not of finding the guru, not of seeking the answer. Anybody who is seeking the answer is in flight from the answer, because the answer is not sought, it is faced. You know what it is. You just have to face the demands that it will make upon you, because it isn't easy. Somebody isn't going to pass by your prostrate form and touch you on the head and tell you you're enlightened. It's going to be burned out of you the way the dross is burned away from the precious metal in the alchemical furnace. It takes courage and commitment and a willingness to make what Plotinus called the flight of the alone to the alone. This is what shamanism is about. We do have a good time with each other. We do have a good time with all these drugs and copulating furiously upon them and making metaphors with them. But the truth is that it is the narrow neck that challenges us and the narrow neck that authenticates us. And when you pass through it, each time you come to the other side, you've taken a step along the path of knowledge that is irrevocable. You are not set back. Nature loves courage. Nature is an infinitude of doorways, opening into authentic being, calling to us with the voice of our ancestors, the spirits of the planet, the time travelers that rove the centuries ahead of us, and who knows what else. The whole fact of being is a palpable, ongoing, continuous miracle. And we know this. We feel it. But we are the programmed victims of a death-dealing society. So our task becomes, I think, to use the empowerment that these kind of gatherings give us, and to use the self-recognition that we can each have here, that we are not alone. That, I'm saying this because I'm glib, but we all know it. That's how I'm able to say it. It is elicited from the group mind. If it weren't in you, I would be incomprehensible. So we form then an understanding. And then we each are strengthened in the private trials of our souls when we go to meet these things, when we try to hammer out a relationship to the ally, when we try to hammer out a relationship to the denizens of our own unconscious. This is life authentically lived. And I'm sure that you're probably like me in that you come to these kind of gathering points from a much more mundane life, a life of a scramble for sustenance and whatever career mongering we're all doing. I mean, very few of us have a chance to keep the white-hot image of ourselves as a skywalker in front of us. But nevertheless, this is the fact. This is the internal myth that drives us and delivers knowledge and delivers authentic being. And it takes a very, very small number of people to make a change, especially when the change is not resisted. Because what we're saying is not menacing to the establishment. It's utterly incomprehensible to the establishment. So we can formulate in our benign neglect, we can formulate our own self-image. And when finally in the chaos of the world, we are asked for what our answer would be, what solution we would propose, it will be all there, all finished, ready and waiting. This is how mutation, real mutation, occurs in biological populations. It isn't that there's a mutation and suddenly it works better and so it takes over. No, it's that the mutation is always there in the background and is never significant until the conditions change. It gets dry, it gets wet. Suddenly, those mutant genes that allowed an organism to survive in wetter or drier conditions make all the difference. So we are a residual mutation that will not die, that is carried along in the bloodstream of the beast. And every 20 or 30 years or so, like the hatch of locusts or the coming of some other natural phenomenon in the ecosystem of the planet, there are waves of reform and of transcendent hope. It begins in America with the transcendentalists. As part of that now, we have only to bide our time. This shamanic model is at the very centerpiece of the new society that will be constellated if there is to be any future society at all. That's it, I think. Well, now we should talk more. I mean, that's just it's like a summation or what I wanted to do out of it. So now we should react against this and
let me give you also, okay, when you talk for your audience, let me just take a few minutes, not long, to give you one other mythic image to think about that I recently come into focus again, which relates very much to the kind of apocalyptic millennial types of discussions and images that Terence has been conjuring. And that's the story of Kali in Hindu mythology. Ajit Mukherjee, who's a scholar of Indian tantric art especially, has just produced another one of his extraordinary books, and it's called Kali, the Feminine Force. In Hinduism, especially Hindu Tantrism, the goddess is regarded as the dynamic life force. Consciousness is thought of as basically inert. And needing to be galvanized into life by the dance and the power of the Shakti, which is the female power. And you get these symbolic images of Kali dancing on the inert body, lying prone on the ground, sometimes with an erection of Shiva, and sometimes just lying as if dead, and she's dancing on his body. That's their picture of the entire universe process. So, as you know, they also have this vision of 4 descending world ages of increasing density, tightness, and darkness, and evil, and degradation and degeneration, after which the whole cycle starts over again. And we're now in the middle or end phase of the Kali Yuga, the fourth and tightest and most grimmest phase of the cycle. And the story that relates to that is that Kali is born out of the head of Durga, who is herself the feminine form of Shiva as the destroyer transformer, who is a warrior goddess, Durga, and she goes around slaying demons. And there comes a time in which the Asuras, who was basically demons, and they're male demons. The Asuras, sometimes referred to as violent gods or jealous titans, or something analogous to titans in Greek mythology, and the closest to anything that the Hindus have in terms of like something like the devil. It's not there isn't one figure that incarnates evil. They're basically, the Asuras is sort of like a cosmic mafia. They basically break all the rules and do everything opposite to the gods. The gods are trying to help the evolutionary process along, and then the Asuras are trying to do the opposite. They're into power and violence. And the humans are, of course, caught between these two factions, and plus the animals and so forth. They've got their own trip going. So there's this time that comes when the Asuras, the activities of the Asuras, the violent fighting and control trips, that the asuras, the fighters, the warriors, the militarists, male, run on each other and on other people, other beings in the world, gets totally out of hand, and the gods become alarmed. Like in the story of Gilgamesh, and they say, we've got to do something. These asuras are getting out of hand. You know, the world itself is being threatened. This could have repercussions on other systems and so forth. And the gods go to Durga, and Durga says, okay, it's time for Kali. Produces Kali out of her head, and Kali proceeds to deal with the situation by devouring all of the male demons, the asuras. And you see these pictures of their bodies, heads and arms cut off, flying through the air, and Kali just shoveling them in. So what is that image? This is the image that some people, New Age people, refer to as Gaia, the earth, doing the corrective action needed in order to deal with the imbalance created by an amok technology applied by paranoid militarists. And the kind of devouring, that's in fact what is happening. Asuras, as well as, of course, many humans, are being devoured. Heads and arms and limbs are flying through the air. War, torture, famine, pestilence, all the four horsemen of the apocalypse. That's all the Kali age. That's the balancing process of the earth going on. And I'll just give you one other reflection connected to that, which is that this theme that the earth is redressing the balance. You get this out of a lot of the Indian prophecies, the Hopi prophecies. The earth is going to go through this time of purification, and then there's various myths about the elect being able to take off in time and so forth, which needn't concern us, but the emphasis on the purification. So what form does that take, see? One of the things that I was shown in one vision was that if it got to the point, if the ecosystem degradation got to the point that a violent reaction became necessary to turn the thing around before it being blown up, let's say, then what would happen would be an ecological disaster on this planet. That would be the Earth's response. An ecological disaster of such proportions, global proportions, that it would take the entire combined cooperative use of all of human resources of all countries and nations simultaneously, diverted away from a military technology, which is where the bulk of it presently goes, and a concerted effort to deal with the problem, forcing people to cooperate against a common enemy. And that is, in fact, what I think is going to happen. And I think it's going to happen during the next 10, 20 years. The ecological crisis will grow to the point where many people feel, myself included, that's already reached that point, where it is an unmitigated worldwide disaster that dwarfs everything else, including nuclear war, because nuclear war, after all, is a threat. It's a possibility. It may never happen. The eco-disaster is already happening. It's in full swing. The greenhouse effect and the population explosion are only the two last factors that are gradually dawning into people's consciousness as adding and multiplying the factor even far beyond everything else. The greenhouse effect, which is really misnamed because greenhouse suggests something positive that promotes growth. The greenhouse effect is actually a heat trap, a planetary heat trap or fever condition of the planet that we're in and that we have no way of stopping. The best we can do now, according to the latest computer projections, is to slow it down, to slow the inevitable rise of at least 1 degree overall global temperature, which could result in major disasters worldwide, including the desertification of the entire American Midwest grain basket, will either take 20 years or 15 years or 25 years, depending on the kind of action we take. So, this is the significance of the Kali, the myth of Kali, which is Gaia, which is the earth correcting herself and redressing the balance, purifying herself, doing a corrective action. So I wanted to share that with you for further reflection.
The image that I always hold of all of this, because I try to be a rationalist and an optimist, and it's very difficult to be both, I think. But I don't think we ever slipped out from beneath the control of nature.
No.
That man is not some kind of abomination run amok inside what would otherwise be a very ordered and pleasant situation. It's that the planet itself is destabilizing. The last 10 million years have been more unstable, with more glaciations than the previous 100 million years. And the appearance of human populations is simply to the present moment, the most extreme example of the destabilizing forces loose on the planet. But evolution does not proceed at a steady rate. It appears to go faster and faster. And historical time is like the career of intelligence just putting the pedal to the floor, and you're pushed back in your seat and you begin to accelerate. This is what history is, and we are now accelerating at such a rate that, as Ralph very eloquently pointed out, there are processes in motion that are real and measurable that show beyond a shadow of any controversy that we are living in times such as have never been known before. The dissolution of the ozone in the atmosphere, the clearing of the Amazon, the pandemic spread of diseases and information, the complete globalizing of the whole human family so that we essentially do live in a global village. What happens in Bangladesh and Argentina and Anchorage is all reported everywhere in the same day. The kind of ecotastrophes that Ralph mentioned, the AIDS epidemic is one of these. The AIDS epidemic, like the spread of nuclear weapons, another epidemic, have been wonderful stimulus to sober thought about our condition. And, I believe that the Chernobyl disaster in the Soviet Union was really what turned the Kremlin leadership toward rethinking their foreign policy, because the explosion of a single power plant was like dropping a drop of ink in a glass of water and watching the entire glass of water turn slightly gray. And we're talking about the atmosphere of the only planet suitable for human life that we know of. And people just said, my God, when 3 Mile Island nearly melted down, if it had melted down and the federal capital of the United States of America had to be relocated 100 miles to the south, this would be a more ecology-conscious nation today. I mean, we got through by the skin of our teeth. But the image that I think is large enough to contain the violence and the desperation of the situation and still offer some hope is the image of birth. That we are somehow the children of the planet. We are somehow its finest hour. And this may grate on some people as anthropocentrism, but I actually espouse a certain kind of modified anthropocentrism, because I don't think we're like fruit flies and giraffes and even, God save us, dolphins and chimpanzees. There is something different about this species. The evolutionary biologists say what it is that we have maintained, we are omni-adaptive. The strategy of other animal species is to define a niche, a tight set of conditions, and then to perfectly occupy that niche. We don't do that. What we do is we redefine niches. We remake things so that we can go there. We dress ourselves so that we can inhabit the Arctic. We invent fire so that we can keep it with us, so forth and so on. We are some kind of experiment that nature is indulging herself in, an experiment with the efficacy of epigenetic codes. Previously, the coding system that has been ubiquitous throughout nature has been the evolutionary code of the nucleotides that form the codons of DNA, that code for the structure of proteins that then compete in a kind of structural environment of adaptability. But the epigenetic information that we carry through song, through writing, through dance, storytelling, and electronic media is a whole different ballgame. We do not forget. We bind time. We bind the past. We anticipate the future. We are going hyperspatial. We are claiming a whole new dimension for biology that it never claimed before. Always before, biology has operated within the confines of the immediate moment. But with the invention of writing and mnemonic skills, and still more so with the proliferation of electronic media, we are actually becoming a fourth-dimensional kind of creature. Our past lives. Our future is somehow with us. And you'll recall early on I said that the shaman journeys through time. The shaman is the paradigmatic figure for the future state of all humanity. What is happening is a birth process. And in the same way that a fetus and its maternal matrix eventually must be parted, or else toxemia sets in and threatens the life of the mother and the infant, in that same way, we seem to have been groomed for metamorphosis into our own imaginations. This is where we are going, and this is what our peculiar cerebral, self-reflective property is about. Now, history is a wink of God's eye. 25,000 years maximum, a geological instant, which begins with people chipping stone flint and which ends with people walking through a violet doorway into, what? Galactic citizenship. A super civilization spread throughout space and time and through levels and continui that we can barely conceive of or imagine. I mean, we are like Paleolithic man staring dumbly into his campfire and seeing there the shimmering towers of Babylon and Memphis and Athens and Rome and New York and saying, you know, what is it? What is it? What is it? It seems so important, it looks so familiar, and yet it's utterly incomprehensible. Our future is our mystery. Our destiny is to live in the imagination, and the historical process that we're going through is not, I think, cause for despair, but it is a major transition point in the life of the entire planet. And I would like to think that 1,000 years from now, the planet will be empty of human life. That, you know, the forests will be creeping out into the grasslands. The animal populations will be stabilized. The sequestering of heavy metals will have been completed. And the planet, like a woman who has just given birth to an 11-pound baby, will just breathe an enormous sigh of relief. And we, following our shamanic inclinations, following the self-transcending image of shamanic flight that leads us to build space shuttles and starships and L5 colonies, we will have followed our imagination into the unimaginable vistas of artistic creation that are our true destiny and home. And we are now in transition. the most difficult part of any birth process. Blood is being shed, there's screaming and groveling and waves of tension sweeping through the planet, sweeping through the human population, but it is an anticipation of a higher, wider, freer, kinder kind of being that we have always held up as an ideal for ourselves with the notion of the shaman. The superman or woman who knows the secrets of the animals, moves with the subtlety of the wind, is always capable of appropriate behavior, is at home everywhere, and leaves no mark. It's our aspiration. It's our guiding image. What we need to do, I think, is articulate.
Leaves works of art.
Yes, it sheds works of art.
Leaves records.
We excrete ideas. We leave a contrail of artifacts as we move through time. And they're rotting in the jungles of Belize and Guatemala. They're parched on the sands of Egypt and Iran. And there are more artifacts ahead of us. An endless shedding of our architectonic and imaginary dreams as we move toward the quintessence, which is the self, which is this transcendent object at the end of time that has cast this vast shadow over our dreams, our poetry, our aspirations, our art, our self-image. And we can each know this here and now. The psychedelics put you in on the joke. You no longer are caught in the unfolding drama. You have seen the end. You have acted as a go-between. You have discovered the way in which the world actually works. Well, now I'd like to hear from some of you, if we can tie this up for people. Sure. This gentleman. Oh, yes, microphone.
Well, I basically agree with a lot of things that you have been talking about, Terence, and giving the mass of thoughts and information, I'm trying to just answer and put some points out that I feel important in the whole context that you are talking about. One is just a simple thing in the beginning. You talking about psychedelics. I didn't quite get whether you make a distinction between synthetic psychedelics and organically grown.
No, I make a definite...
Yes, I know that you make the difference, but within your talk, you mentioned LSD at several times in a way that I got the impression that you look at LSD as something that is not synthetic.
Well, LSD is kind of a borderline case. I'm probably under the spell of Albert Hoffman's recent visit. LSD-like compounds occur in morning glories and were the basis for certain hallucinogenic rites among the Mayans and the Toltecs. LSD is a sort of a hybrid. Ultimately, I suppose I would be sort of anti-LSD because the problem with LSD is it's so easy to make 1 million hits. And 1 million hits is not a party. 1 million hits is a governmental problem. And that's what undid LSD, was the fact that it was so easy to manufacture truly society-disrupting amounts of it.
That was its main function. Most likely.
Well, but don't you think a burrowing from within strategy might have gotten further? Like, I believe that the reason Leary decided to use LSD in the Harvard experiments was because Michael Hollingshead made the case to him that they could manufacture so much of it. Leary's original inspiration was psilocybin, but there were physical constraints on its manufacture.
Oh, yeah, the facts are... I'm just saying that, I might not have done it that way, but that's the way it happened, and that seems to have been what what the historical process came up with. Something that could be manufactured could be in large amounts, giving hundreds of thousands of people access to an experience that before only a few had had. So like reaching that kind of 100th monkey mass quantum mass action threshold.
I mean, thinking in these quantitative terms, it's a very male thing, and I just wanted to put this question because my experience with my own experience, as well as what I have seen in many other cases where other people taking LSD, is that it is extremely affecting your body, and that it is creating confusion, possibly, and that you should at least take into consideration that it is developed by a Swiss company, and even Albert Hoffmann, that who I really appreciate as a wise, nice old man, is a man still, and it is done in the whole context of patriarchal chemical work. Sandoz is destroying the River Rhine, and besides all these things, they have developed LSD.
Yes, well,
okay. I just wanted to mention that very briefly. It's not the main point that I wanted to come to.
Can I answer it anyway?
Sure.
Basically, I agree with you. I bend over backwards to be liberal because Ralph once accused me of being the most conservative person he knew. But I think you're right, that the fact that it can be manufactured means it can be manufactured badly. And what you want when you take a psychedelic is something that you know where it came from, you know what it is, and you don't have to worry about, were people orphaned, or did evil people manufacture this, or is the money being used to hold down black South Africans, so I think plants. My advice to someone who takes it seriously, who wants to get right on this issue, is grow your own mushrooms. You should grow your own mushrooms for several different reasons. First of all, if you can successfully grow mushrooms, you probably can take them, because in the process of growing them, it has taught you cleanliness, punctuality, attention to detail, all these traits which are very useful then when you take it. And then you know what you have. You've watched grain, rye, a human food, turn into pure psilocybin, and it all happened in your own basement. So no middlemen, no question of sources, no question of international chemical companies, so forth and so on. No, I think you're right to be very sensitive to this issue of synthesis, origins, and the karma of these things. But now go on.
Well,
please.
your answer is even an answer to my next point, which is that we have been talking a lot about whether or not taking drugs, which is, from my impression, not even a serious question for most of the people here. But the more important question that I found was not dealt with enough is the question how we take it. We live in a culture where we have not many tools or transmissions of knowledge how to use properly plants. And what you're just saying about mushrooms is a very good point, how we can learn to deal with something properly instead of just buying it and consuming it. And the last remark to this question of how, where I would like to hear maybe a few sentences from both of you, is the point that, because I think Ralph mentions the mysteries of Eloises at a certain point. And what I know, or one point that I remember, is that people were only allowed once in their life to get this visionary experience.
That's right.
And you pointing out that the visionary experience is maybe the most important, I would say, I mean, in shamanic cultures, quite often it was just the shaman who would go for the visionary experience and then have the challenge to share that with his people, and not everybody was just going for visionary experience. And what happened in the psychedelic movement was that everybody was going for visionary experience again and again and again and again, without, or even by doing that, losing his motivation of bringing his vision back to his life and to his people.
Well, people don't know how to do it, you're right. And so maybe it's useful. I mean, this is certainly tying up loose ends. I feel like this is where we really soar out toward the edge and stretch the envelope of the institution. But you must know how to do it, right? And so how you do it, in my humble opinion, but based on experience, is first of all, you take a committed dose. You don't take some namby-pamby, piddling, testing it out, toe in the water kind of dose. Because, even in the gospel, Christ says, it's the lukewarm that I vomit out of my mouth. Don't bring me any dilettantes, no dabblers, no drugstore cowboys. So you take a committed dose. What is a committed dose? A dose that when you think about taking it, you feel fear. That's a committed dose. So you take a committed dose. And then you take it on an empty stomach. And then you take it in silent darkness. Leave your Walkman alone. Forget Mozart. Forget the Pink Floyd. Forget Bach's choral preludes. It's ridiculous. All that stuff sounds fine without these things. And this is heresy to some people. I mean, to some people it's all about choosing the music. Again, this selling out, what the hell? You can't illuminate your mind without having a synthesizer diddling in the background. So, silent darkness, committed dose, empty stomach, and then it's very simple. You lay down, you shut up, you close your eyes, and you look at the back of your eyelids with the expectation that you may see something. Now, people have in describing this back to me, people have called that the McKenna method, which seems to me just, you must be nuts to think of it that way. Because I talked to someone, I won't name him, but a great researcher, widely published researcher in psilocybin. And he'd done 80 trips and given it to 25,000 people and so forth. And I said, well, what did you make of the hallucinations? And he said, I never closed my eyes. And I realized, that these guys are just quaking with terror. And a lot of people, the main reason in the 60s, I saw a lot of people who took LSD for one reason only, committed dose in a shamanic situation. And and now I'm not advising this. This I do not advise, but this is how I do it. I do it alone. I have never understood the obsessive need people have to take drugs in groups. It just makes my flesh crawl. And the only time I've ever been able to do it comfortably was with Amazonian people and mestizo people where there was a language barrier. But if I take a psychedelic with somebody, then I listen to them breathing, and I hope they're all right, and I get all tangled up with are they all right, and should I say something, should I not say something, and it just turns into this mother hen thing that I can't stand. And often when I take psychedelics alone, I pass through a place where I say to myself, boy, I'm sure glad there's nobody else here, because I think this would really alarm them. At this point, people would be reaching for 411, and since I can't, it's not going to turn into an embarrassment for me. So I think, committed dose, silent darkness, empty stomach, lay down, shut up, be still. Keeping still, the I Ching says. It's all in keeping still.
Okay, so far to set and setting. And the last thing that I wanted to mention in this context, that from my own experience, there's more than just this set and setting and dosage, which has to do with the cleaning of the gates of how do you say, Pforten der Wahrnehmung?
Perception, doors of perception.
Doors of perception, because in my own case, and again what I saw with many other people happening is that if you still have some narcissistic patterns in your system or in your psyche, things, you first of all will have difficulties to stay in a place like you can do that. And what happened to many people is that they either got difficulties to handle that situation and would do all kinds of things that would damage themselves, or if they would go through, they would run around with some kind of omnipotent feelings. I mean, there is serious research being done about the fact that Hitler has taken mescaline and got some of his visions, so not through his dark and deep wounded soul, other than he did.
Well, eventually it becomes an aesthetic question. I mean, you know, the trick with psychedelics, as with life generally, is to be in good taste. I mean, it is not tasteful to vomit on your partner or declare yourself the world messiah. This is embarrassing, and it's happening, but it's inappropriate. I just think, you know, the rules don't change when you take psychedelics. You still, there's no license to be a jerk. The thing about narcissistic hang-ups and stuff like that, usually I just feel that the person hasn't done enough, and that sometimes you really have to clobber people, that the dose is insufficient.
That's a good response to. But let me just briefly ask, in terms of your basic question on how, to Terence's suggestion, which centered mostly on dosage and setting factors, practical, down-to-earth physical factors. I would emphasize the factor of intention, i.e. set, more than he has. And to me, actually, intention is the single most important criterion for a productive kind of experience. Terence is basically assuming a clarity and authenticity of intention. And many people who experiment and dabble in psychedelic drugs, as he was saying, you know, do it for all kinds of reasons, such as being able to say that they've taken it once, or because their friends suggested it, or because they want to be less insecure about their sexual hang-ups or whatever it may be. The intention, if whatever your intention is in going in, the entire flow of the experience will be a response to that. You may not understand what the hell it means, or what the significance really is, and that's your challenge then to try to figure out, and that may take you years and months. That's why for some people one psychedelic session was in fact enough. Not because they were afraid to repeat it, quite the contrary. That was the thing that connected them to their source of, they got their instructions, and they can live with that the rest of their lives. Other people make a specialty of exploring various other areas and exploring the possibilities of tools and applying them in various contexts, such as healing or creativity. I also feel that in a way we're in a much more experimental age, and that ties back than, you know, the traditional shamanic societies were. While I personally lean towards testing out and working as much as possible with the tried and true ways, not because they're shamanic, but because they've been tried. They have in fact worked. They've demonstrated their ability, but that does not preclude the possibility that there may be new ways of working with these medicines that are still have integrity in relationship to the basic evolutionary purpose of how you're approaching it, but that may be completely new. Such as, for example, and that could apply even to equally to synthetics or semi-synthetics like LSD or plant substances, to use them in combination with techniques of yoga, with techniques of birth. I personally know of many instances where these breathing techniques, or known as the name of rebirthing, have been very effectively combined with low doses of MDMA, where the MDMA adds a kind of a catalyst, making that kind of technique much more effective, or conversely, during an MDMA experience where a person gets stuck in a certain way, then using a breathing technique that they've already learned to dislodge them from that stuck place. So I think the possibilities of also I think the thing Terence says about the totally committed dose, the full trip, yes. I think there are also possibilities of low dose kinds of experiences that allow a certain different kind of entry and access to the other worlds, not as radical, not instead of, or not that one is better than the other, but it's another dimension. I feel about these plants that they are allies. They're tools, but they're more than tools, because along with the tool comes a living intelligence, someone that you can respect and communicate with. And so it's more appropriate to call it an ally in your work, in our work of fostering the evolutionary process on this planet. And so the only reason I continue to work with it is because I've encountered the allies. Unexpected. I didn't know that when I was in graduate school, much less even undergraduate or college or high school, that I would one day be working with teaching plants that can tell us about what it is like to be a human being and what the proper role of human beings on this earth is, and what we are to do. Nothing could have been further from my imagination. And yet it's presented, and I've come to accept the arrival of a new tool or a new ally, such as one of these plants, as a sign almost that I'm on the right track. I'm on the right track. Suddenly you meet somebody who's like a powerful guy, say, hey, I know where you're going, I know how you're trying to get there, and this will help you. I say, thank you very much. Respect and honor that. And try to understand as much of what's going on. Knowing that we'll never know everything there is to know. There are things that, the interesting distinction, Terence was talking about the mystery, and I think this is the key to it. It's being open to the mystery and maintaining our openness to the mystery. If we close ourselves off to the mystery, if we have answers, we're lost. We're dead. Or as punk gangsters now say to one another, "Your history, man." Right? They've done something that's offensive to them. This is the insult. "Your history, man." So if we close ourselves off to the mystery, we're history. The backwaters. Bye-bye, humans. And that's happened before, according to the records. And so anything we can do to keep ourselves open to that mystery, and also recognizing that there'll be some areas that we'll never know. The mystery itself has this allure, It has a magnetic attraction for us. We want to explore it. It draws us out of ourselves. And yet there are also realms that, and Castaneda talks about that in one of his last books, that are not only unknown, but unknowable. Unknowable in principle. We will never know. And to recognize the difference between those two realms can save us a lot of time and trouble. Because if we try to go into the realms that are in principle unknowable, we're likely to get very, very confused.
I have to say that I've taken LSD over 1,000 times. Let's get the microphone or else.
Okay, I'd like to say something or ask directly about the subject of how-to, which you've been discussing. And I'll say it in as quickly a way as possible so you can put your answer together the way you want. Potential problems in taking this. I've said to people, have you taken a lot? Have you ever seen this stuff? And they haven't quite been in the dark. I've gone out, and it's hard to find a place that's dark. There's a lot of lights everywhere.
Well, no, you don't go out. You just close the door and turn out the light.
Then the question is, I talked to Kat a little about this, and she said, no, don't do it in the city. You're absorbing all the vibes of everybody around you.
Well, it's true. We live in the country, but it doesn't have to be pitch. You just take your cone tent and go out to Joshua Tree and up a canyon and...
So you agree with the thing about not taking it in the city?
No, I think it's totally weird to take it in the city.
But
as long as, before we move on, one thing I'd like to say about technique, it may seem small here, but it someday may save you great wear and tear in a tight situation. And that is, if you get into a place in the psychedelic that is difficult. Western people seem to freeze at the controls, and what you need to do is sing and recognize that sound is a tool for pushing energy around, and you can just move past an unpleasant exhibit by chanting your way through it. And all the things that we're taught as spiritual tools, mantra, yantra, mudra, all these things which never work worth a damn most of the time, work perfectly in that state. In fact, that's probably what they were designed for. I mean, all these things are totally frustrating to me, but in the psychedelic state, yantra, mantra, chanting, singing, drumming, as advertised, can move you through these spaces. Let's give somebody else a chance. A woman back here, either Gigi or the lady in the...
It's not on.
It is.
Is it? Yeah. I just had a question about ritual. You mentioned the Terence method and everything.
Disgraceful, but yes.
Yeah, well, it's good advice. But so I was wondering what other rituals you do repetitively other than just like the normal brushing your teeth kind. But do you
mean in my personal life?
Yeah. Is there anything that you do every day or every other, month that you just...
I spend as many hours a day as I possibly can smoking cannabis. This is a practice.
This is the secret of Terence McKenna's philosophy.
Thank you very much.
People,
this is a practice that I've adhered to since my 17th summer. And, God knows if I put in the same amount of time on yoga or writing plays. I also throw the I Ching at the new and full moon.
What are you doing to decriminalize marijuana?
What am I doing to decriminalize it? Well, I always talk about it whenever anybody asks. It's funny how rarely the subject comes up, even in groups like this. It's almost as though marijuana is the poor country cousin. We're all here talking about 5-methoxy, hydroxy, this and that. And the lowly cannabis weed, which has been with us since before the Vedas were a gleam in some Indo-European warlord's eye. It's very interesting how the metaphors of cordage are also the metaphors of creativity, that we weave a story and we spin a yarn. And all the connection between fibers and cognitive processes has always been well understood. I think cannabis has a bum rap. What I'm doing to decriminalize it is being fairly out front about my devotion to it. I just think it's trivial and silly, and it's like trying to outlaw masturbation or something. It has to do with having a torqued notion of human nature. These things exist. I'm not recommending that for everyone, but when I was young, I was what's called a nervous child. And the first time I had a hit of cannabis, I realized that I could self-medicate myself to normalcy and be just like everybody else. And so I did that. And I don't know if it's the proper place to tell it, but once I became concerned that I did too much smoking. And so I decided I would quit. First of all, I wanted to see if I could quit. And then I wanted to see how much of my interior life was actually riding on this ocean of cannabis ingestion. So it so happened that the conditions for the experiment were perfect because I was arriving on a small desert island in the Seychelles group in the Indian Ocean and had rented a house on this island in order to write a book. So I had this Mombassan bomber weed and a lid of it, and I just rolled it up and nailed it above my kitchen door and decided that I would not smoke until I had finished writing this book. And was relieved to learn that I had enough self-control that this was possible. I mean, I didn't sleep a wink for 8 nights, but I did not resort to breaking my pledge, and I slowly realized it was all right. What it seemed to do was I spent a lot more time reading and had much more interesting dreams, and otherwise it didn't seem to be any big deal. And I wrote this book then, and it took me about 6 weeks, and I had promised myself that when the book was finished, I would then allow myself to smoke up this lid of weed before I left this island. So finally I finished, and I was very diligent. I wrote every day at 8 a.m. for till noon. I typed, and then I would take my dogs and explore this island. I had this very set regimen. And finally the book was finished, and I rolled these huge bombers and dragged my lawn chair out under the coconut palms and waited for the sunset to get really going, and then I just flared and consumed about 3 of these things in about 5 minutes. And I was just waiting for this sense of relief and accomplishment and clarity to sweep over me, and this thing began to happen, and I pushed it away, and then it came back, and I pushed it away, and finally I realized I had to look at what this was, that it was just becoming overwhelming. And then I looked at it, and what it was the incontrovertible, instantaneous, deep, unarguable realization that this book I had written was dog shit. And I was just frozen just sitting in this chair, quaking with this realization. And up to a half an hour ago, I had this vision of myself returning triumphantly to Berkeley like Lenin entering Moscow with the tome raised high. Don't worry, brothers and sisters, it's all figured out. And I realized, that I was a catastrophe, an abortion, a monstrosity. So I just was, really set back. So then I just shrugged my shoulders and said, oh, okay, I will smoke day and night until I can try and save this thing, if it can be saved. And I did. I did smoke day and night, and I did struggle with this thing, and it was not possible to breathe life into that corpse. This book, I'll just tell you the title in order to convince you that this thing should have died a borning. It was called, I blush to tell you, it was called Crypto Rap, Meta-Electrical Speculations on Culture. Terrible. So I realized then, at that point, that I was a fool to try to navigate life without cannabis, and that it would just get me in terrific trouble, and that I lost my way and couldn't make judgments and had no discrimination, and so forth and so on. Anybody? Yes, sir, you've been struggling mightily to be heard. Next.
I've taken LSD over 1,000 times, and I've taken psychedelic plants a couple hundred times. And I agree that plants are superior, and I prefer them over LSD. However, real, true LSD, such as orange sunshine, is a phenomenal mystery, in my experience, compared to the rinky-dink acid that's going around these days. But to the guy who was talking about LSD, I wanted to say that LSD is not confusing. It's the environment and the accumulative unconscious mind, the things that your unconscious mind has collected, that is confusing. It's the environment and society and what they program into your computer that is confusing, not good, true LSD.
But on one level, LSD is confusing, which is that when you buy it, you don't know what you've got. That's truly confusing.
If you buy it from people who don't chant mantras and aren't into a high state of spiritual awareness and vegetarianism, I get it from people.
Listen, I know weasels who chant mantras every day.
And they have to know chemistry.
I know where I get it. I know where I get it from.
But see, that's too much to ask of most people. I recall a conversation I had once with a psychotherapist about MDMA, and he said, it doesn't matter that it's toxic at twice the ordinary dose, because I would never give somebody twice the ordinary dose. And I said, but X, you don't understand. People pop this stuff like pretzels down on Sunset Strip. So you have to think of the fool. The fool is always with us. And, No.
I've eaten a whole sheet of 100 doses of LSD.
Well, maybe the fool is not always with us with an attitude like that. No, but it is, the thing about LSD that's confusing is the difficulty to tell what you've got until you're out in it. Shishi, what was your point? Ba 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 ba.
Being that you're both in many ways a master of words, I want to go back and pick up on this fine line that you admittedly are walking in describing the plants as an ally and at the same time describing them as a tool and continually talking about use. And I find also in the questions using the word take a lot, which is our common language around this. And people have asked some questions about the ritual. And also, Ralph, I was glad to hear brought up intention. And I'm curious, knowing that in the Native American traditions, there are very simple teachings that respect the exchange when you interact with a plant, whether you pick a piece of sage, you give a giveaway at that point, whether it be some saliva, whether it be something that you offer, that in the traditions that you have been working with, if either within the intention or within the rituals there are these kinds of giveaways and exchanges, and you might comment some more on those so that they can sort of fill our body in this way. Or you might share also some of your own if you carry that deep sense of ally.
You want to do that?
Well, it's hard to describe a ritual, and they are not only the rituals. I think Terence and I share an abiding interest in the rituals surrounding these plants in traditional cultures, and at the same time, I feel, and I think he probably agrees too, that it's not a matter of copying the Indians. We live in a different time, in a different place, so I see a lot of very fruitful experimentation going on. Experimentation that's not just random, and that's informed by clear intention and by deep study and reflection, and grows organically. So I see people have numerous groups and circles of people that have worked with these substances, both the synthetic and the plants, do have serious intentions and bring to bear a certain creativity that emerges out of those experiences onto how best utilize the experience while it is a matter, the plant itself is the thing that you take, so but it's the meaning behind it, the spirit behind it, that's really significant. The significance of the psychedelic movement is not the drugs. It's the experience that was facilitated by the drugs. And that in itself then makes the plants or drugs significant. It's a kind of a paradoxical thing. I don't know if I'm getting at your question. So I think there are rituals, and one of the basic rituals that I've become most familiar with and is adapted from, I know groups that use some of these substances, in a ritual that's adapted from the Native American church, and yet it's not a Native American church ritual. I would not presume to try to run, for example, a Native American ritual or try to direct one, or so, because that's something that's taught by those who have been initiated in that way and is passed on that way. But some of the basic core features, such as sitting around in a circle around either a fire or in darkness, and having something like a talking staff, which is a ritual that comes very strong in the Northwest American Indians, Northwest Coast. The talking staff often used in councils, and also in the peyote church, that's the staff and rattle are passed around for people to sing during the ceremony, which allows each individual who is participating in the circle experience, group experience, to express some part of their own visions through their song or their statement. And yet each person's own individual vision and journey is honored. In other words, you don't react to it, you don't respond to it, you don't give encounter group challenges, questions, arguments, and so forth. Is that getting at what you're asking? I'm not sure. Okay.
Two things about it. I'm not looking for a description, of the whole ritual per se, as much as I'm tracking what you brought up earlier in the week about, or the weekend, about this memory that was way before, that there's some relationship with the plants that in our modern time and even in the traditional societies perhaps has been overlooked or forgotten or shifted. And I'm curious about the experience of giveaway, the experience of exchange, which is part of this relationship with plants, which very quickly gets lost in our language and in some of our modern usage of them as tools. So I was looking for any sort of traces of that in your own sort of use, relationship with them. And also curious because this topic has come up in terms of the cultures in which these plants are culled from or visited, that these are also the cultures which seemingly are having a great deal of difficulty holding on to their plants. In other words, the destruction of the rainforests, etc. And what is that all about in terms of this allyship?
Right. I'll just say briefly, and then
go ahead. Then I'll say something.
What I get from that was that you're asking, what are we giving the plant in exchange for what it's giving us? That's what I hear you saying. Yeah. What's the giveaway? The giveaway is the exchange. And what I've learned from the plants is an understanding of our proper role, and my particular role in life on this planet. That's the whole notion, this whole thing of this Gaia conference, the Green Earth work that I was mentioning to you. That's what I learned from the plants. That's what was emphasized, and that's what I've learned from previous non-drug, non-plant involved shamanic kinds of experiences, vision quest, or however induced. Similar kinds of communication with animals. I had dreams with animals like whales and dolphins, or these plant spirits telling me, okay, here's what the situation. You understand the situation. Once you understand the situation that we find ourselves in, once you really face it, as Terence said, there is only one course of action that's possible for all of us. I'm convinced. I mean, it has many different forms. Realizing the Gaia, the place of the earth that we're at, and what we're doing in our blindness and stupidity is tantamount in a way. It's another aspect. It's the reverse side of this vision that Terence is talking about. It's the vision that once you see it, it's incontrovertible, and it's inescapable, and you know what has to be done. And it's just a matter of time and having the grace, and then to not get caught in despair or cynicism, all of which are possible outs that we've all used. Despair, cynicism, or escape, blotto, denial, burying ourselves in career, blah, 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 whatever. And just getting on with it. Clean up our act. Clean up our act. Over to you, sir.
Well, I think what a person who has a relationship with an ally plant gets out of it is an enriched and balanced inner life. What the plant gets out of it is a human being with an enriched and balanced inner life. And that feeds back then into stewardship, an inspiration for caring. We then notice that we have this partner, and agriculture was the first great example of human-plant symbiosis, and it was very important to the plants involved. They went from being rare grassland endemics to being great monocultural crops. And orthodox biologists say that successful reproductive strategy signifies successful evolution. So you can say what people got out of taking mushrooms in ancient Africa was increased visual acuity, better sex, and ultimately a rich inner life of cognition. But what the mushroom got out of it was cultivation, and by being associated with cattle, becoming like an episome on the main genetic heritage of human beings. Because when we finally do go to Aldebaran and Procyon, we will take cattle with us, and presumably we will take beans and peas and hemp and spinach. They are the cloud of genes that have managed to insinuate themselves into a relationship with human beings, so that our fate is their fate. And if the sun gutters out and is left behind by us as we radiate out through the galaxy, we will take with us dogs, cats, goldfish, runner beans, morning glories, ayahuasca, but not everything.
And is that your finding, both of you, in terms of that being the ideal or that being the sense that you personally carry? Is that your finding in the people that you work with, this birth of feeling of stewardship?
Yes, I think so. That you can't take these things without facing the facts of the historical crisis, our legacy, our bad behavior, so forth. And that when you face that, then you have to have recourse to some kind of stewardship. I don't know people who are seriously into psychedelics who don't want to change things. I don't know of anybody who says, I take psychedelics and I'm perfectly contented with the world the way it is. Then I wanted to say something else about ritual, and here again I take a controversial position, and it never would have occurred to me to take this position except that the mushroom told me this. This is straight from the shoulder. Said, ritual is a substitute for understanding. It's exact words. And I said, I don't get it. Said, if you understand, you have no need of ritual. Ritual is like a mnemonic device for touching something deeper, which is in danger of being lost. So I recall a situation where I was in the Amazon and we were collecting ayahuasca plants, myself and a young botanist who was Peruvian but very westernized. And we chopped through the ayahuasca bush, and we hadn't talked for a long time. And then as we were chopping it up and putting it into the bags to carry it out of the forest, he said to me, don't you think that we should have done a ritual and blown tobacco smoke over it and asked the plant permission to cut it, none of which we had done. But as we had cut the plant, this had all been going through my mind, and I felt that the moment was so intense that ritual would have been a trivializing of it. And so then I realized that what ritual is for is to ignite attention. That's all. And you must have attention. And Ralph was very good to bring up intentionality, which is a state of attention to what you're doing. And when you incinerate a bud of cannabis or cut an ayahuasca plant or gather mushrooms, it's not necessary to perform a ritual, but it's an abomination to have an empty head at that moment. I mean, you must feel what you're doing. You must be aware that a gift is coming to you, that a life is being sacrificed so that you can deepen your experience. So I don't know if this goes to your question. Ultimately, the give-take question, I think, can be dissolved in that it really is an in-out question. What do I take? What do I give? The planet is a gene swarm, and there is only one destiny for life on this planet. It is the destiny of all of it. And when we take these plants, we are synergized to higher states of intellectual activity. This creates redistributions in the patterns of propagation and growth of the plants. We are inside some kind of huge natural control mechanism. We cannot fail to be in Tao, but we can fail to recognize that we're in Tao. And so it's always a task of bringing back attention and reclaiming a feeling of authenticity in the moment.
I guess I would reformulate your statement about ritual being a substitute for understanding in two ways. One is that I see ritual as a framework for communication and a framework for structuring your intention. The kind of ritual you perform comes out of your intention. So if your ritual is empty, a ritual empty of intention or consciousness is just that, an empty substitute for the real thing. And I also realize that, especially if you're alone, and going through that kind of an experience, as long as you are clear about your intention and you're going about what you're doing with the maximum of consciousness that you can, you are in fact doing a ritual. You're doing the essence of ritual. And when you're out in the wilderness and you do everything with as much consciousness as you can, every morsel that you eat, when you take a shit, everything, when you breathe, when you brush your face, brush your teeth, or sweep your campsite, everything becomes a ritual, which means simply that you have clear intention and clear maximal awareness. Your attention follows your intention. If you think about it. What your intention determines what you're going to attend to. And so I think the ritual has its place, and it has to be recognized for what it is, and it has to be imbued with your awareness and your intention so that it doesn't become empty. We all know numerous empty rituals. The churches, the organized religions are full of them. And they're harmless or not so harmless diversions.
Other considerations? Yeah. Oh, take the mic, please.
Getting back to the taking of such substances, Dr. Israel Regardie, who is the last in the original lineage of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn out of England.
Boy, I'll bet there's somebody who will contest that. But go ahead.
He was the last living English.
He was in that lineage anyway.
Of that lineage. And he'd made the statement that he would not accept a probationer into or a neophyte for initiation until they had undergone 100 hours of psychotherapy, because he had seen how imbalanced people could become through the work of high magic. Do you think that applies to the use of psychedelics?
Do I think psychotherapy should be a precondition to the use of psychedelics? Is that the question?
God, let's
hope so. I mean, I hope that's the question.
That's that's the question, veiled by which veils do you think that people who do not have knowledge of how the psyche operates, have not really investigated their own psyches, should then take psychedelics, take large doses?
Well, I don't know. Certainly, I don't think psychotherapy is a precondition to taking psychedelics. I mean, psychotherapy is, probably the kindest thing you can say about it is that it's a scam. Certainly, a person should be sophisticated about the dynamics of psyche. And I would, if Ralph's prescription to have clear intention is followed, I don't think a person would arrive at the brink of a psychedelic experience.
If you needed psychotherapy instead.
If they didn't have a healthy interest in the dynamics of the psyche. Most psychotherapy, as it's currently practiced, is, I think, just, as I said at the Albert Hoffman thing, psychotherapy without psychedelics is pissing into the wind and has done a lot more harm than good. What is clear about psychotherapy is that its efficacy depends entirely on the psychotherapist. Freudians, Jungians, Reichians, and what have youites all get the same results, which are 1/3 get better, 1/3 get worse, 1/3 stay the same. So clearly method is useless in psychotherapy. It's something about a bonding between two people to sensibly discuss hang-ups. What I think is generally felt to be true among psychedelic researchers is that early psychedelic trips tend to have a personalistic cast to them, tend to address one's hang-ups, problems in relationships, difficulty in coming to terms with parents and loved ones and so forth. But that people who persist with psychedelic experimentation quickly burn through that. One of the objections that I always sort of had to LSD was that I call it abrasively psychoanalytic. This seems to be a compound that only wants to talk about what are basically therapy issues. It wasn't like that for everybody, I gather, but it was certainly like that a lot for me. I mean, I stuck with psychedelics basically because I was so puzzled by what other people were saying about it. Psilocybin, on the other hand, doesn't seem, at least in my experience, to work that way. It immediately dresses this transpersonal, cosmic, planetary level. So my own exposure to psychoanalytic literature and therapy and that sort of thing was I read all of Mysterium Conjunctionis, or Ion, and this is where the real skinny is held. I don't think you can read a better book on the psychedelic experience than Mysterium Conjunctionis. And it doesn't mention psychedelics per se, but it deals with the motifs of transformation. And no, I think that if there's a relationship between psychotherapy and psychedelic shamanism, it's that psychotherapists must apprentice themselves to psychedelic shamans and must learn what they're doing, because they're doing better than 1/3 get better, 1/3 get worse, 1/3 stay the same. Neurosis in extremely shamanically oriented societies with a tradition of psychedelics is almost unknown. And I saw these people work in the Amazon, and their intuition and their perspicacity in dealing with human situations was clairvoyant, you know? I mean, they just could go right into it. And so I think the relationship between psychotherapy and psychedelic shamanism should run the other way. To my mind, and I've made this metaphor many times, but it gives the right feeling to it. Psychedelics are to the study of consciousness what the telescope in the 16th century was to the science of astronomy. And, the telescope was suppressed. I mean, Galileo had to humble himself. Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake. Now they want to suppress the inner telescope, the telescope that brings the stars and galaxies constellated in the human psyche up for close inspection. Well, I suspect they shall have the same fate as they had with the suppression of the telescope. They will just be looked at as pedestrian, plebeian Philistines, and the people who had the good sense to advocate this, people like Ralph Metzner, will be hailed as forward-looking visionaries.
The only thing I would add to that analogy, I think, that of the telescope is that because the telescope, after all, is used by astronomers, a rather select elite group of people. The average man probably never in his lifetime looks through a telescope. The significance of the psychedelic drug in terms of enhancing our perception, expanding our consciousness, in addition to that, it has a potential for doing it for anybody, not everybody, but anybody who wants and needs it, who feels drawn to it. And so it's a tool that's unique, and this ties back to the theme I mentioned at the beginning. The age of shamanic experts is over. That was the old age. I mean, there will be experts, of course. There are people who are more practiced and skilled and experienced at it. The elders, the ones who've done it the longest time, are the ones you go through for guidance and training and so forth. But everyone has to make their own discoveries. Everyone has to explore their own psyche. Nobody else can do that for you. I wanted to say one other thing in relationship to your question. I don't want you to take this in any way critical of your asking of the question, but I wanted to actually have you think about the assumption, the presupposition that underlies that question. Because you're asking us, in a way, you ask something like, should people who take psychedelics be required to undergo therapy? That's asking a question about who should or should not ingest certain substances. It's a control question. And I understand your intention is, protection of people flipping out and all of that. But we shouldn't be asking anybody that question. We shouldn't be asking ourselves, basically, or anyone else that question, looking for those kind of criteria. We should take responsibility for our own path, and that will serve as an example to other people. Everyone has to find their own way. Psychedelics is not the way for everybody. There are many people who never should, in quotes, use it, and who never will, and who don't need to, and who will get quite possibly to the same spaces as we get without that way. And my always standard answer when people start asking questions about, how do I actually get there? How do I actually make that connection? Well, okay, Terence has given you an actual practical hint. Grow your own mushrooms. That's certainly a way to go. I tend to give a more evasive answer, which I really mean in all sincerity, which is that if the psychedelic visionary plants is going to be a part of your way, your path, you will find your way to them at the appropriate time, when needed, no sooner and no later. If your intention about it is clear and good, and that's not to say you may not make false starts and you may have some trips and decide it's not for you. That's okay too. There's no requirement. It's everyone for himself, and yet we're all for each other at the same time. And if you're clear about your own intention, and you take responsibility and inform yourself and be discriminating, do the best you can, that by example will spread to others. Your friends and associates and people you come into contact with will follow your example and won't need to follow your advice.
But before we leave it, I have to tell a wonderful story about the telescope, which relates to what we've been talking about. The telescope seems to be a good metaphor for psychedelics. When Galileo discovered the telescope, he was not immediately slapped down by the church. It took a few months for them to even sort out what the issue was here. And then, of course, eventually he had to recant. But in the year preceding his trial, Galileo was, of course, before the invention of the telescope, well known in influential circles in Rome as an inventor and scientist, natural scientist. So in his apartment on the rooftop, he set up his telescope and would hold small garden parties for influential Roman citizens, among them great cardinals and princes of the church who were involved in deciding the issue of whether or not he was dabbling in heretical material. So one evening he had Cardinal Roncalli of the Holy Office, which is the keepers of the doctrine of the faith, and had him to dinner and said, Excellency, would you care to look through my telescope? And the cardinal allowed as how he would like to look through the telescope, and so Galileo pointed it at the full moon, which was rising over the city, and the cardinal peered into the telescope, and Galileo said, and so, Excellency, as you see, there appear to be oceans and range of mountains on our sister world. And the cardinal looked for a long time and said, yes, but Signor, surely we can agree among ourselves that this is only a hallucination. Well, it turns out they couldn't agree among themselves that it was a hallucination, and I don't think that we can agree with our establishment that what we perceive is only a hallucination. It is, and yet it isn't. It is a true hallucination. I remember once in the Amazon, very bizarre incident. I was lying with a fever in a hut, and some horrible thing had happened to me anyway. I was in a terrible state, and I heard these children singing outside in Spanish. And the song that they were singing, as I slowly and painfully translated it, I could hardly believe my ears. The song was, Behold, behold, the final illusion. At last, the final illusion. And this is, I think, from the point of view of historical society, what we are looking at. We are looking at the final illusion. The body of Eros, expelled from Greece, burned at Eleusis, driven out of the European mind by busy and pesky celibates, denied, repressed, cut apart, lay in wait in the mountains of the New World for the European civilization that would eventually conquer the New World. And as it burned and pillaged and raped its way deeper into the interior of the new continents that it proposed to put under European sway, at last, in 1953, Gordon Wasson glimpsed the final illusion. It lay like the body of Osiris, like the body of Eros, lost since the fall of paganism, but waiting there to spread back through this proud, vain, scientific, paternalistic, male-dominated society, and to lay the seeds of its undoing, to lay the seeds of an archaic revival, of a return to the way we lived when the glaciers were melting and the game was plentiful, the way we lived when there was partnership and goddess worship and ecstasy and a sense of community and globalism. And this is what we have found. You remember I said yesterday that the archetype of Western society is the prodigal son, the wanderer who leaves his birthright, who leaves the comfort of the village and the bride who was planned for him, and goes out and does something tremendous and ambiguous and unimaginable, and returns with the gift, difficult to obtain, returns with the healing plant, the magic word, the jeweled crown, and lays it at the feet of the mother so long parted from, and by that act creates a historical closure. You'll recall at the beginning of this weekend I talked about the hexagram that had been thrown for the fate of our planet. Work on what has been spoiled. Through the line, work on what has been spoiled by the Father. And what has been spoiled by the Father is the feminine and the planet as the exterior manifestation of the feminine, leading to the change, which is the cauldron, the alchemical vessel, the theater and laboratory of the witch's magic, the potion that transforms. And in the act of transforming nature through cooking, in the act of transforming human nature through the cooking of the historical process, we have made ourselves unrecognizable to our ancestors, even as we shall be unrecognizable to our children. But, ladies and gentlemen, this souffle is done. This pie is cooked. It's time to take it out of the oven, give the oven a rest, and spread the board. You know, with the passing of the patriarchy, I recall that wonderful line in Finnegan's Wake where Joyce says, "Grandpappus has fallen down, but Grinny spreads the board, sunny side up with care. If you want to be parked, if you want to be phoenixed, come and be parked. Because up Nayent, prospector, you're going to sprout all your worth and woof your wings." And so that's what I invite you to do. To woof your wings.
Woof your wings.
Woof, woof.
Woof, woof.
That's all I've got to say. Ralph's got to catch a plane.
I'll give you one footnote to the word hallucination and hallucinogenic. Hallucination we generally think means seeing something that isn't really there. So then Terence talks, well, but what about these hallucinations that are really there? And long ago we used to say, in the 60s, we used to say, well, hallucinogenic is not a good name for the psychedelic drugs because it's not a matter of seeing something that isn't there. It's a matter of seeing something that is there, but that you normally don't see. And then I looked up the original etymology of the word hallucination and found to my interest and delight that it comes from Latin hallucinare, which means to wander in your mind. It has nothing to do with illusion.
Right.
A hallucination is your experience in wandering through the psyche. A hallucinogenic substance or plant is one that induces you to go on a journey in your mind. And that's a very appropriate term for that. And whether what you see is an illusion, a falsehood, a mask, or what it is and what it means, that's up to each one to find out.
The greatest adventure still lies ahead. Want to say something? Shishi, do you want to say something?